All right, let's dive into something really fascinating. The heart of acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. You want to know how those incredible, transformative relationships between therapist and client actually happen in ACT?
Yeah,
We're going to break it down.
sounds good.
Using this chapter from an ACT book, it's all about how ACT and this thing called psychological flexibility totally reshape the dynamic between the therapist and, the person they're working with.
Hmm. It's funny. There's this assumption that because ACT is like rooted in all this science and research, it must be really rigid, maybe even a little cold. But you see what happens in real ACT sessions, and it's a whole different picture.
Oh, yeah, totally. This chapter even mentions how people observing these sessions are often struck by how deeply moving they are. Like they walk in expecting the super clinical, detached thing, and then bam, they're blown away by the genuine connection that forms.
Yeah,
Especially when the client's dealing with some really intense stuff, like this unexpected warmth just kind of emerges. What's the deal with that?
it's ACT's whole approach to therapy. Like it just tosses the traditional therapist-client power dynamic right out.
Wait, hold on, break that down a little. What do you mean by throwing out the power dynamic? Does the therapist literally say to the client, hey, we're equals?
It's definitely more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
ACT is built on this idea of a psychology of the normal.
Oh.
So both the therapist and the client are just humans,
Hmm.
dealing with the same messy, beautiful, often challenging, human experience. The same mental traps that, trip up the client are things the therapist grapples with too,
Gotcha.
both in their professional life and personally.
So it's not the therapist up on some pedestal, all-knowing and wise. It's more like two people kind of side by side, acknowledging they're both in the same human soup.
Exactly. And ACT actually uses this shared experience to help both the client and the therapist move forward. It becomes this collaborative journey, not a one-way street where the therapist is handing down pronouncements from on high.
I like that. It's refreshing, actually, because I think a lot of people, myself included, kind of have this, baggage about therapy being this hierarchical thing, like the therapist has it all figured out and you're there to just receive their wisdom.
Yeah.
It feels so much more human.
Right. And this emphasis on collaboration, on this shared experience, it's essential when you start to consider the social side of psychological flexibility or inflexibility.
Okay, now you've got me curious. What's the social side you're talking about? Because when I hear psychological flexibility, I'm thinking about individual stuff, like how I handle my own thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. Well, think of it this way. A lot of our struggles, like when we get totally fused with our thoughts or we're constantly trying to avoid uncomfortable stuff, that's often learned behavior. We
Hmm.
pick it up from our families, our friends, like the whole social soup we're swimming in. Even our sense of self, who we think we are, it's formed in relation to other people. It's an I-you thing, not just an isolated I.
Hmm. Wow, that's so true. I never really thought about it like that. But I mean, our values, our beliefs, so much of what we consider ourself, it really is shaped by the people around us.
Exactly. And even the act of going to therapy itself, it is social interaction. You're seeking connection, support, understanding from another human being.
So, how does all this play into how an ACT therapist actually approaches that relationship with their client? What's different compared to more traditional therapy?
It creates this amazing opportunity because all these processes, the fusion, the avoidance, the way our sense of self gets all tangled up with others, it's all happening right there, live in the therapy room.
Oh, wow.
And because the therapist is coming from this place of we're in this together, they can address it head on, both in their own behavior and in how they're interacting with the client.
Okay, mind blown. So, the therapy relationship itself kind of becomes like this living experiment where the principles of ACT are being tested and put into practice in real time.
You got it. It's not just talking about concepts. It's about both the therapist and the client embodying those concepts in their interactions. It's almost like you're looking at a powerful relationship under a microscope.
Now that you mentioned powerful relationships, this chapter encourages us to think about one in our own lives. What makes it so strong? And what does that tell us about psychological flexibility?
That is a great exercise. Think about a relationship that truly lifts you up, helps you become the best version of yourself. What qualities make it so special?
Okay, I'm thinking about my relationship with my mentor. She's been such a guiding force in my career and my life. And what makes it so powerful is this deep sense of trust. We can be totally honest with each other, even when it's hard.
Hmm, that's a fantastic example. And think about this. Does she try to change you, force you into some mold? Or does she just let you be you, even when you're making mistakes or feeling lost?
Oh, totally the latter. She never judges me. She just listens, and she's there for me no matter what. It's like she sees my potential even when I don't.
That right there is acceptance in action, one of the core principles of ACT.
Hmm.
And it's not about condoning bad behavior. It's about acknowledging the full spectrum of who we are, the light and the shadow.
It's about creating that space for growth without the pressure of judgment.
Exactly. Now, how does your mentor usually respond when you're sharing your struggles with her? Does she get all caught up in your emotions? Or does she help you create some distance from those feelings?
It's interesting. She rarely tells me what to do. She asks questions. She helps me see things from different perspectives. And sometimes, when I'm really spiraling, she'll even crack a joke to lighten the mood.
That's a perfect illustration of diffusion and present moment awareness. Two other key aspects of psychological flexibility, and they're woven right into the fabric of your relationship.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. Is this leading us to how the ACT therapist embodies these qualities? Like, is the therapist essentially trying to create the kind of connection we're talking about, but within the context of therapy?
You are absolutely on the right track. And it brings us to a really crucial point soon. The therapist as a role model. Remember, even therapists are human.
Right.
They're not these perfect beings who have achieved total psychological flexibility.
Right.
They have struggles, they get triggered, they experience difficult emotions, just like everyone else.
Okay, that's kind of comforting to know, actually. Because honestly, the idea of this perfectly flexible therapist always felt a bit intimidating. Like, how am I supposed to live up to that?
It's not about being perfect. It's about how the therapist handles those moments of struggle. Do they get all tangled up in their own thoughts and feelings? Or do they model what it looks like to practice ACT principles even when faced with really difficult content?
So it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Absolutely. And this chapter gives a really powerful example of how this might play out in a real therapy session. Imagine a client talking about something incredibly difficult, like experiencing abuse as a child. That's the kind of topic that could easily trigger strong emotions in the therapist.
Oh, yeah, I can see how that would be a challenge, not just for the client, but for the therapist, too. I mean, they're human. They have their own experiences, their own wounds.
Right, and the chapter emphasizes that it's not about the therapist pretending they don't have those reactions. It's about what they choose to do with them.
So how might an ACT therapist navigate that kind of situation? Like, what would it actually look and sound like? So how might an ACT therapist navigate that kind of situation? Like, what would it actually look and sound like?
Well, instead of shutting down or trying to offer some, generic platitude, the ACT therapist might actually acknowledge their own struggle.
Huh.
Maybe they say something like, wow, what you're sharing is incredibly difficult to hear. And honestly, it's bringing up some heavy stuff for me too. I'm noticing some judgmental thoughts popping up, maybe some anxiety. But I'm going to try my best to just be with these feelings, make space for them, and stay present with you right now.
Wow, that's really powerful.
It's that authenticity and vulnerability that ACT really encourages. It shows the client that it's okay to struggle, that even the therapist, who's, supposed to be this expert in managing emotions, has their own human moments.
It kind of blows my mind that instead of trying to hide their discomfort, the ACT therapist actually uses it as like a teaching moment.
Yeah.
They're modeling the very principles they're trying to help the client learn.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It transforms what could be a potential obstacle into an opportunity for connection and growth.
Yeah.
And this ability to model psychological flexibility, even when things get really tough, it's just one of the many tools in the ACT therapist's toolkit.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some other leverage points that help create these powerful therapeutic relationships?
This chapter talks about the importance of the therapist cultivating something called an observer perspective. It's about stepping back from the need to, overanalyze or explain everything through language.
Okay.
Instead, it's about approaching all experiences, both internal and external, with this sense of mindful, non-judgmental observation.
So it's not just about understanding ACT intellectually, like memorizing all the definitions and concepts. It's about embodying it, living it in those moment-to-moment interactions with the client.
Exactly. And, this goes hand in hand with another really important leverage point, a willingness to, approach challenges head on rather than avoiding them. You see this thread throughout ACT, this idea of leaning into discomfort rather than trying to escape it.
Which makes sense. I mean, avoidance is a huge part of why a lot of us end up in therapy in the first place, right? We're trying to outrun our pain, our fear, all the icky stuff.
Exactly. And you can imagine how powerful it is for the client when they see their therapist, this person they've come to trust and rely on, modeling that willingness to face difficult emotions, difficult experiences head on. Especially if the therapist can say something like, I've been there too. I know how hard this is. But I also know it's possible to move through these challenges and come out stronger on the other side.
That's so much more powerful than some empty platitude, right? It's
And
like, hey, I'm not just preaching this stuff. I've actually lived it. And if I can do it, you can too.
precisely. And that brings us to another key leverage point, embracing contradiction and uncertainty. You see, life is messy.
Oh, yeah.
It rarely fits neatly into those perfect little boxes we try to create in our minds.
Right.
And the ACT therapist, instead of trying to, force resolution or offer easy answers, they model a comfort with ambiguity, with not knowing.
That is such a challenging concept, though, especially in our culture where we're constantly being told to figure it all out and find the answer. How can a therapist actually model that acceptance of uncertainty?
Think about it this way. Imagine a client coming in feeling totally lost and confused, saying something like, I just don't know what to do with my life. What's the right path? What am I supposed to be doing? Instead of jumping in to offer advice or solutions, the ACT therapist might say something like, it's okay to not know. Life isn't about having all the answers. It's about embracing the journey, the exploration, even when it feels messy and uncertain.
That is so powerful. It shifts the focus from finding the right answer to being okay with the uncertainty, the not knowing, which is a huge part of life, let's be real.
Exactly. And remember that idea we talked about earlier about ACT challenging the traditional therapist-client power dynamic?
Yeah.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Because instead of positioning themselves as the expert who has it all figured out, the ACT therapist acknowledges that they're on this journey alongside the client. It's that we're in this stew-together mentality.
I'm really starting to see how all these pieces fit together. It's not just about the techniques, it's about the entire stance the therapist takes. They're not this authority figure dictating how to live. They're more like a fellow traveler sharing the journey.
Exactly. And you see this reflected in the way ACT encourages therapists to offer reassurance. It's less about giving advice or telling the client everything will be okay, and more about offering this empathic, soft reassurance rooted in shared human experience.
So what would that sound like in practice? Because I think a lot of people, when they're struggling, they really do want that reassurance, that validation that everything is going to work out.
Imagine a client coming in feeling totally overwhelmed, defeated. They're saying things like, I'm such a failure, I'm letting everyone down. Instead of saying, oh, you're not a failure, don't worry, everything will be fine, the ACT therapist might say something like, I hear how much pain you're in right now. And it makes sense that you're feeling this way, given everything you're going through. It sounds incredibly difficult.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that would feel so much more validating than some generic, it's all going to be okay statement. Because let's be real, sometimes it doesn't feel like it's going to be okay.
Right.
And hearing someone acknowledge that without trying to sugarcoat it can be incredibly powerful.
Exactly. And that brings us to another interesting aspect of the ACT therapist's role, selective self-disclosure.
Ooh, I'm curious about this. Because I know in traditional therapy, therapists are often discouraged from sharing too much about themselves, right? It's all about maintaining those boundaries, keeping the focus on the client. So how does ACT approach this?
It's definitely a delicate balance. But ACT recognizes that when used appropriately and with the client's best interest in mind, sharing personal experiences can actually deepen the connection and make the therapist more relatable, more trustworthy.
So it's not about the therapist hijacking the session to talk about their own problems. It's about using self-disclosure strategically to create that sense of shared humanity.
Right.
Normalize the client's experience.
Exactly. For example, let's say the client is talking about feeling incredibly isolated and alone in their struggles with anxiety. The ACT therapist, instead of just offering generic validation, might say something like, I used to really struggle with anxiety too, especially in social situations. I felt so isolated, so afraid that people would judge me. It was incredibly painful.
Wow. That would be so powerful to hear from your therapist. It's like, okay, this person I respect and admire, they've been there too. Maybe I'm not so broken after all.
Exactly. It can be incredibly validating and normalizing for the client to hear that their therapist, this person who's supposed to be this well-adjusted, emotionally stable individual has actually faced similar challenges.
It makes me think about the role of spirituality in therapy, something a lot of people kind of shy away from. But this chapter actually talks about how ACT, while not religious, has this kind of spiritual quality to it. Like it acknowledges this deeper dimension of the human experience without getting all dogmatic about it.
Yeah, that's a great observation. ACT really does emphasize values, meaning, and this like transcendent sense of self,
Hmm.
all themes that have been traditionally associated with spirituality. It encourages clients to connect with what truly matters to them, at their core, and to build a life that aligns with those values.
So it's less about imposing any specific belief system and more about helping the client tap into their own inner compass, their own sense of purpose.
Precisely. And this focus on values naturally leads to a deep respect for the client's autonomy and choices,
Mhm.
even if those choices differ from the therapist's own values.
This is so crucial, especially when you're working with clients who might be engaging in behaviors that, society considers unhealthy or unacceptable. It's about honoring their journey without judgment.
Absolutely. And this chapter specifically cautions against using language like choice to manipulate clients into making decisions that the therapist thinks are, right. It's not about pushing your agenda. It's about helping the client explore the potential consequences of their actions and supporting them in making choices that align with their values.
It's about empowerment, not control. I love that. Now, one thing I've always appreciated about ACT is that it doesn't take itself too seriously. It has this refreshing sense of humor and irreverence, and I think that can be so helpful when you're dealing with heavy stuff.
Yeah. ACT definitely embraces humor as this powerful tool for diffusing from those sticky, painful thoughts and emotions. It recognizes that life can be absurd, that we often get so tangled up in our own minds, and that sometimes the best way to untangle ourselves is to just laugh at the whole ridiculous situation.
It's like taking a step back and saying, wait a minute, am I taking myself too seriously here? Can I find a way to lighten up? Approach this with a bit more playfulness.
Exactly. The chapter even suggests that many ACT techniques are inherently irreverent, like they're kind of poking fun at the systems that try to keep us all boxed in.
Okay, so how does this actually play out in therapy? What would it look like for a therapist to use humor in a way that's, helpful and appropriate?
Well, imagine a client who's beating themselves up over a mistake they made. The therapist might use some playful language like, wow, you really went all in on that mess up, didn't you? You get an A+ for effort.
Uh-huh.
Or they might share a self-deprecating story about a time when they made a similar blunder.
It's about creating space for laughter, even in the midst of all the pain and struggle. It's like giving the client permission to not be perfect, to embrace their humanness.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can be incredibly liberating,
Mhm.
especially for clients who are used to approaching their problems with a lot of seriousness and self-criticism.
So we've talked about all these amazing leverage points ACT therapists can use to build this powerful and transformative relationship. But I'm guessing there are also some potential pitfalls, things to watch out for. It can't all be sunshine and roses, right?
You're right. There are definitely some potential traps that therapists can fall into,
Right.
even when they're well-intentioned and trying their best to practice ACT principles.
Okay, let's talk about those because I think it's important to acknowledge that even with a framework as powerful as ACT, there's always room for, human error.
Right.
Things can go off track.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest pitfalls this chapter highlights is the danger of like over-intellectualizing ACT. It's like turning it into this academic exercise instead of a lived, embodied experience.
Which brings us back to that point we made earlier, right? It's not about memorizing the definitions and concepts. It's about integrating those principles into your way of being, both as a therapist and as a human being.
Exactly. And the chapter cautions therapists against getting caught up in trying to explain the theory or convince the client that ACT is the right way to think.
So it's not about turning therapy into a debate about whose ideas are correct.
Not at all. The focus needs to stay on the client's experience, on helping them connect with their own inner wisdom and discover what works for them.
Hmm.
It's about empowering the client to become their own therapist, in a way.
Which makes so much sense because ultimately the client is the expert on their own life, right?
Right.
They're the ones who have to live with the consequences of their choices.
Exactly. And, this ties into another potential pitfall. The risk of the therapist, even one who's experienced in ACT, inadvertently modeling psychological inflexibility.
Okay, I'm intrigued by this because we talked earlier about the therapist being a role model. embodying those ACT principles in their interactions with the client. So how could a therapist accidentally model the opposite of what they're trying to teach?
It all comes back to the fact that therapists are human beings, just like everyone else.
Hmm.
They have their own triggers, their own blind spots, their own moments where they get hooked by difficult emotions or challenging client behavior.
So it's not about pretending to be perfect. It's about recognizing when you're getting caught up in your own stuff and being able to step back.
Right.
Course correct.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this requires a willingness to be, like, relentlessly self-aware, to notice when you're slipping into judgment, avoidance, or any other form of psychological inflexibility.
It's like, okay, I'm human. I'm going to mess this up sometimes. But when I do, can I catch myself? Own it and use it as an opportunity to model those healthy coping skills for my client.
Exactly. And it's about being compassionate with yourself in those moments.
Yeah.
Because beating yourself up for not being perfectly flexible is just another form of inflexibility, right?
Oh, totally. It's like, oh, I'm not perfectly flexible, so I'm a failure. Now I have to avoid dealing with this feeling of failure. And down the rabbit hole we go.
Exactly. And the final potential pitfall the chapter highlights is an excessive focus on emotional processing.
You know, this is something I've always been curious about because there is so much emphasis in our culture on, like, feeling your feelings, on processing your trauma, on releasing all this pent-up emotional energy. So how does ACT approach this? Is there a danger in going too deep into that emotional realm?
ACT definitely acknowledges the importance of making space for those difficult emotions, of allowing ourselves to feel what we feel without judgment or resistance. But it emphasizes that emotional processing is not the end goal.
So it's not about chasing that emotional catharsis for its own sake. It's about using our emotional experiences as information, as guideposts on our journey toward, a more fulfilling life.
Exactly. The focus should always be on helping the client take action that's aligned with their values, on supporting them in building a life that feels rich and meaningful, even in the presence of challenging emotions.
It's like saying, okay, it's understandable that you're feeling this way. Now, what do you want to do about it? How can we use this experience to move you closer to the life you want to create?
Precisely. And that's what makes ACT such a powerful and transformative approach. It's not just about symptom reduction. It's about fostering this deep and lasting sense of well-being. It's about helping people create a life that feels rich and meaningful, even when it's hard.
It's about embracing that whole messy, beautiful, often challenging experience of being human.
Well said.
Wow, this deep dive has been, like, seriously eye-opening.
Yeah.
We've explored all these core principles of ACT acceptance, diffusion, present moment awareness.
Right.
And we really dug into how they play out in the therapeutic relationship. It's clear that ACT isn't just about, like, techniques or tools.
Yeah.
It's about a way of being,
Totally.
a way of relating to ourselves and others that can be truly, like, life-changing.
And it's important to remember that this approach to therapy, it's not about the therapist being perfect or having all the answers, right?
Right.
It's about showing up authentically, being compassionate, creating that safe space for the client to explore their own experiences, without judgment.
It's acknowledging that both the therapist and the client are human beings, just navigating this crazy, messy, beautiful thing called life. We're all in this stew together, right?
Exactly. And when the therapist embodies those principles of psychological flexibility,
Yeah.
it creates this ripple effect. The client feels seen, heard, and empowered to, step into their own wholeness.
It's like the therapist becomes a mirror, reflecting back to the client their own capacity for healing and growth.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the goal is to equip the client with the tools and the insights they need to become their own therapist, to navigate all the ups and downs of life with more awareness, courage, and compassion.
As we've been talking, I've been thinking about how these principles go way beyond the therapy room. Like, how may understanding psychological flexibility change our relationships with our partners, our kids, our friends, even, like, strangers we encounter in our everyday life?
That is a great question. Imagine approaching all your relationships with that same sense of acceptance,
Yeah.
curiosity, willingness to be present with whatever comes up.
Yeah.
It could totally change the way we connect, communicate, support each other.
This deep dive has given me so much to think about. I'm already noticing myself approaching, like, difficult situations with more awareness and flexibility. It's like I have this new set of lenses, and it's pretty amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And remember, the journey of psychological flexibility, it's ongoing.
Yeah.
It's not about reaching some perfect state of enlightenment or anything. It's about showing up, being curious, willing to learn and grow every step of the way.
Well said. So, to everyone listening, As you go about your day, I invite you to consider this. How might bringing even a little bit of psychological flexibility into your life change how you interact with the people around you?
Hmm.
What would it look like to approach those tough conversations with more openness, more compassion? Food for thought as we wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.